Today, Argentina stands at another crossroads, as it has so many times before. New leaders promise new solutions. Economists debate whether this time will be different. The infinite loop seems inescapable. Yet 45 million people continue building lives, raising families, and hoping that maybe, finally, stability will come. Their resilience is both inspiring and tragic. The resilience of people who have learned to expect disaster and survive anyway. Argentina's story is ultimately not about exchange rates or debt ratios. It's about what happens when a nation becomes a laboratory, when human lives become data points, when the world watches and studies and theorizes while real people lose everything again and again. Remember, Argentina, it could happen anywhere. What if I told you that one country has experienced hyperinflation, currency collapse, debt default, and economic chaos not once, not twice, but over and over again for an entire century? Welcome to Argentina, the world's unofficial economic crash test dummy. A nation that once stood among the wealthiest on earth now serves as a living laboratory where economists watch, measure, and theorize while 45 million people live through the consequences. Every economic disaster you've heard about has happened here, sometimes multiple times within a single generation. This is the story of how a promised land became a perpetual crisis zone, and why some believe it was never an accident at all. Rewind to 1900. Buenos Aires glitters like a European capital transplanted to South America. Grand theatres, ornate architecture, and boulevards lined with cafes where intellectuals debate the future. Argentina is the world's 7th wealthiest nation, richer than France, Germany, or Italy. Ships arrive daily carrying immigrants who believe they've found the new land of opportunity. The nation's fertile pampas produce enough grain and beef to feed continents. Money flows like the Rio de la Plata itself. Economists predict Argentina will rival the United States within decades. The phrase rich as an Argentine becomes common in European parlours. No one standing in those elegant streets could imagine what the next century would bring. But here's what makes Argentina different from other fallen empires. Its decline wasn't a single catastrophic event, but rather a repeating pattern. A loop that seems impossible to escape. Over the following decades, Argentina would become something unprecedented in modern history, a testing ground for every major economic theory imaginable. Free markets, protectionism, currency pegs, floating exchange rates, austerity programs, populist spending. They've tried it all. International financial institutions would implement policies here that they'd never risk in developed nations. Graduate students in economics departments worldwide study Argentina not as history, but as an ongoing experiment. The question that haunts this story is whether Argentina broke itself or whether it was broken. The stakes of this story aren't abstract numbers or academic debates. They're measured in the lives of ordinary people who watched their savings evaporate overnight, who stood in breadlines with doctoral degrees, who buried children they couldn't afford to treat. Every crisis created a lost generation. Every recovery raised hopes that were systematically crushed. Imagine living your entire life knowing that eventually, inevitably, another collapse is coming, that your currency will be worth nothing, your bank will freeze your money, your government will fall. This is the psychological weight carried by 45 million people trapped in an infinite loop. And their story begins with the slow unravelling of a golden age. In those early decades of the 20th century, Argentina's wealth seemed limitless. European immigrants poured in by the millions, Italian, Spanish, German, each believing they'd found their promised land. The agricultural exports were staggering. Argentine beef filled dinner plates from London to New York. Wheat shipments helped feed a hungry world. The oligarchy grew fantastically wealthy, building palatial estates and sending their children to European universities. Buenos Aires erected monuments to progress, confident they were building a permanent prosperity. But this wealth rested on a fragile foundation, dependence on agricultural exports and foreign capital. When those two pillars wobbled, everything would change. The seeds of crisis were planted in the very soil that made Argentina rich. The First World War sent the first shockwaves through Argentina's carefully constructed prosperity. European markets collapsed, trade routes closed, foreign investment dried up almost overnight. Then came the Great Depression, and Argentina discovered how vulnerable an export-dependent economy truly was. Commodity prices crashed. The estancias that had seemed like eternal sources of wealth suddenly couldn't pay their workers. Urban unemployment skyrocketed. For the first time, Argentines experienced widespread economic desperation. The political system, designed by and for a wealthy elite, couldn't adapt. In 1930, the military staged its first coup, overthrowing an elected government. This established a pattern that would repeat for half a century: economic crisis leading to political instability, leading to authoritarian intervention, leading to more crisis. From this chaos emerged the most consequential figure in Argentine history, Juan Domingo Perón. A military officer with populist instincts, Perón recognized that the old economic order had failed ordinary Argentines. His solution was radical transformation: nationalize foreign-owned industries, protect domestic manufacturing, transfer wealth from the agricultural elite to urban workers. His wife Eva became the face of this revolution, beloved by the poor, despised by the rich. For millions of Argentines, Peronism represented dignity and inclusion after decades of being invisible. But Perón's economic policies, whatever their intentions, created new distortions. State-owned enterprises grew bloated. Protected industries became inefficient. When agricultural exports couldn't fund his programs, Perón printed money. The first great inflationary spiral had begun. Perón was overthrown in 1955, but removing him only created a deeper instability. For the next 2 decades, Argentina lurched between civilian and military governments, each trying to undo what the previous one built. Peronism was banned but never destroyed. It became an underground force, a movement in exile, waiting to return. Each government inherited the economic contradictions of the last and added new ones. Military rulers tried to modernize the economy through authoritarian means. Civilian governments tried democratic reforms that powerful interests sabotaged. Foreign debt accumulated, inflation became chronic. The peso lost value so steadily that Argentines learned to spend their paychecks immediately, before prices rose again. Economic planning became impossible when no one knew what money would be worth tomorrow. Then came the darkest chapter, the military dictatorship of 1976. The generals who seized power promised to eliminate leftist subversion and restore economic order. What they delivered was the Dirty War, a campaign of state terrorism that killed or disappeared 30,000 people. But even as they murdered their own citizens, these generals opened Argentina to the Chicago School economists, disciples of Milton Friedman, who saw the country as a laboratory for radical free market reforms. They lifted trade barriers, welcomed foreign investment, and dismantled worker protections. Foreign debt exploded from $8 billion to $45 billion. The military's economists insisted the pain was temporary, that prosperity would follow discipline. Instead, they were creating the conditions for the catastrophes to come. Democracy returned in 1983, but the economic time bomb was already ticking. The debt accumulated under military rule had to be serviced. The peso had been devalued so many times that no one trusted it. President Raúl Alfonsín tried stabilization plans, created new currencies, implemented price controls. Nothing worked. By 1985, inflation had reached 1,000% per year. Imagine going to bed with enough money to buy a house and waking up with enough for groceries. That was Argentina in the mid-80s. People rushed to stores the moment they received their wages. Businesses changed prices multiple times per day. The social fabric itself began to tear as everyone scrambled to survive. Then came 1989, and Argentina experienced something that would define it in the global imagination forever: hyperinflation. Not the merely catastrophic inflation of previous years, but prices rising 5,000% annually. Money became worthless faster than it could be printed. Workers demanded to be paid daily, sometimes hourly. Supermarkets stopped putting prices on items because they changed too fast. People carried cash in bags because denominations were meaningless. Savings accumulated over lifetimes vanished in days. The middle class, Argentina's proudest achievement, was devastated. Riots erupted in Buenos Aires, stores were looted. A president resigned months before his term ended. Argentina had hit bottom, or so everyone believed. They were tragically wrong. Enter the International Monetary Fund, the institution that would become both Argentina's rescuer and its jailer. The IMF's prescription was standard: cut government spending, privatize state enterprises, open markets to foreign competition, and end hyperinflation through monetary discipline. These structural adjustment programs had been tested in smaller countries, but Argentina offered a chance to prove they could transform a major economy. What followed was one of the most ambitious privatization programs in history. Airlines, railways, oil companies, telephone services, everything was sold, often to foreign investors at bargain prices. The state that Perón built was systematically dismantled. Argentina became the IMF's star pupil, its model case for what fiscal discipline could achieve. In 1991, President Carlos Menem and his economy minister Domingo Cavallo unveiled their masterstroke convertibility. 1 peso would equal $1, guaranteed by law. The central bank could only print pesos if it had equivalent dollar reserves. In theory, this would eliminate inflation forever and restore confidence in Argentine money. And for a while it worked brilliantly. Inflation dropped to near zero. Foreign investment flooded in. The middle class rediscovered prosperity. Argentines travelled abroad, bought imported goods, and felt like citizens of the First World again. International observers praised the Argentine miracle. The IMF held it up as proof that their programs worked. But behind the glittering facade, the foundations were cracking. The convertibility system had a fatal flaw that economists warned about, but politicians ignored. Pegging the peso to the dollar meant Argentina couldn't adjust its currency when conditions changed. When Brazil devalued in 1999, Argentine exports suddenly became expensive. Factories closed, unemployment rose, but the peso couldn't devalue. Government revenues fell, but the dollar debts remained. To maintain the peg, Argentina borrowed more and more, digging itself into an ever deeper hole. The IMF kept lending, kept advising austerity, kept insisting the system would work if only Argentina cut deeper. It was like treating a drowning person by demanding they swim faster. By 2001, the game was almost over. December 2001, the collapse that would define a generation. The government, desperate to prevent capital flight, froze all bank accounts. Argentines who had trusted the banking system woke up unable to access their own money. The measure was called the corralito, the little corral, as if citizens were livestock to be penned. Rage exploded. Millions took to the streets banging pots and pans, demanding their savings back. Police killed protesters. The president fled by helicopter. What followed was chaos without precedent. 5 presidents in 13 days. Argentina defaulted on $93 billion in debt, the largest sovereign default in history. The peso lost 3/4 of its value. The middle class was destroyed again. The human cost of 2001 cannot be captured in statistics, though the numbers are devastating. Poverty rose from 30 to 60%. Children went hungry in a country that produces enough food for hundreds of millions. Educated professionals emigrated by the thousands, draining Argentina of talent it desperately needed. Those who stayed developed survival skills that would be tested again and again. They learned to distrust banks, to keep savings in dollars, to expect the worst. A generation of children grew up watching their parents lose everything. The psychological trauma became part of the national character. And yet, Argentina recovered. Commodity prices rose, debt was restructured, growth returned, hope flickered again, but the pattern was set. Here's what makes Argentina fascinating to economists and heartbreaking to everyone else. Each crisis generates mountains of research, theories, policy recommendations. Scholars write dissertations on Argentine inflation. The IMF publishes postmortems on what went wrong. Political scientists study the relationship between economic collapse and democratic stability. Argentina provides data that shapes how the world understands financial crises. But knowledge doesn't prevent repetition. The lessons learned from 1989 didn't prevent 2001. The lessons from 2001 didn't prevent 2018, when Argentina went back to the IMF for the largest loan in the institution's history. The cycle continues, and 45 million people continue living inside someone else's case study. The years since 2001 have followed depressingly familiar rhythms. Recovery under commodity boom, inflation returning, currency controls, black market dollars. Another crisis in 2018, another IMF bailout, another round of austerity, inflation reaching triple digits again. By 2023, Argentines were so desperate for change, they elected Javier Milei, an economist who promised to abolish the central bank and adopt the dollar, essentially surrendering monetary sovereignty entirely. Whether his radical experiment works or fails, it represents something profound, a nation so traumatized by its own currency that it's willing to abandon it completely. Argentina's crisis has become so chronic that revolutionary solutions seem like the only option left. The question that haunts this entire history is one of agency. Did Argentina do this to itself through corruption, populism, and fiscal irresponsibility? Or was it done to Argentina by foreign powers, international institutions, and global capital that treated a nation as expendable? The truth is probably both, and neither. Argentina's crises emerged from specific policy choices, but those choices were shaped by international pressures, debt structures, and economic theories developed far from Buenos Aires. When the IMF prescribed austerity, Argentina obeyed. When foreign investors demanded deregulation, Argentina complied. When the experiment failed, Argentines paid the price while the experimenters moved on to other subjects. That's what it means to be a crash test dummy.